In 1848, at the end of the Mexican-American War, the U.S. government took possession of California and soon built a fort on Alcatraz to guard the port of San Francisco.
Alcatraz at night doesn't just look isolated, it feels like the world's last place you'd ever break out of. Yet, on June 11, 1962, 3 inmates slipped out of the so-called escape-proof fortress and vanished into the dark. Frank Morris, with his razor-sharp mind, John Anglin with his calm, calculating edge, Clarence Anglin with that quiet determination, and the forgotten 4th man, Allen West, who never made it out. They left behind a raft, paddles, and life vests, but not a single body. And that's where the story stops making sense. Because what followed wasn't a nationwide hunt, it was silent. A 2013 letter, a strange Brazil photo, FBI tests that answered nothing, and a government that slowly backed away. What if this wasn't just an escape? What if it exposed something no one expected to see? Before we understand why America let this mystery fade, we need to look at how 3 ordinary criminals managed to design the impossible. How did they become the architects of one of history's most perfect disappearances? The architects, engineering genius from behind bars. Frank Morris was not just smart, he was strategic, and he arrived at Alcatraz with a singular purpose that no one truly understood at the time. Guards saw a thin man with quiet eyes, the kind of inmate who blended into the background. But behind that stillness was a mind that tested off the charts. An IQ of 133 inside a prison where most men could barely read already made him dangerous. But what made him unforgettable was how he used that intelligence. Morris treated Alcatraz like a puzzle he was destined to solve. And the moment he walked through the cell block in 1960, something clicked for him. He was surrounded by tough men, yes, but also brilliant in their own ways. The first twist arrived when Morris was assigned to cell 138. Anyone else would have shrugged that off, but the placement was almost too perfect. On one side, he had John Anglin in cell 135, a man who rarely spoke, but whose mind worked quietly in the background. On the other side, he had Clarence Anglin, softer-spoken but relentless when it came to physical work. Both brothers had grown up working southern farm jobs, and the calluses on their hands were the kind that came from years of labor. They were resourceful, fast, and surprisingly meticulous. Their IQ scores sat just below Morris's, but intelligence in that place was not measured by a number. It was measured by survival, curiosity, and the ability to notice cracks in a system that bragged about having none. The 4th man, the one people always forget, was Allen West. West had the kind of nervous energy that made guards underestimate him. He talked a lot, he joked a lot, and he acted like the guy who never planned anything. But that version of him was a mask. West knew the prison layouts better than almost anyone, partly because he had been there longer, and partly because he listened. He knew which guards walked heavily, which ones dragged their feet, and which ones smoked too much and left small windows of opportunity in the schedule. He was the logistics guy, the one who knew the routine so well that nothing went unnoticed. The moment that changed everything came in the most ordinary place. Morris was in the prison library browsing magazines the way someone might pass time flipping through a newspaper. On the rack was the March 1962 issue of Popular Mechanics. Somewhere near the back was an article titled, "Your Life Preserver, How Will It Behave If You Need It?" And for Morris, that title was not a friendly safety guide. It was a blueprint. The article broke down flotation, material behavior, water pressure, and the simple physics of staying alive in cold water. These were details the prison assumed no inmate would ever read deeply. But Morris read every line twice. This one magazine became the North Star of their entire survival strategy because it showed them exactly what the human body needs to stay afloat long enough to reach the shoreline. It gave them equations that most inmates could not even pronounce, but Morris understood perfectly. The article would have been useless if Alcatraz itself had not been crumbling in places the public did not know about. The famous gray walls that looked so strong on the outside had a secret weakness on the inside. The prison had been built during the Depression when budgets were thin. Workers mixed concrete with salt water from the bay, gravel, and brick rubble. It hardened fast, but it aged badly. Over the years, the salt water inside the concrete made it brittle, almost flaky in some corners. Morris tested this by tapping at the vent behind his sink. It should have sounded firm. Instead, it echoed like an old plaster wall. That sound alone told him something huge. The fortress that the world believed was escape-proof had a vulnerability that could be broken down with patience, a spoon, and enough nights of quiet scraping. The fresh insight that truly set the escape in motion came when Morris found a concertina in another inmate's belongings. A concertina looks like a small accordion, and most people see it as a noisemaker. Morris saw something else. When you pull a concertina open, it forces air out in a single direction. When you squeeze it, the air moves back. It was a bellows, a simple air pumping machine. Morris realized the air in the ventilation tunnel could be pushed out faster by using this tool, giving them space to carve without suffocating from dust or triggering suspicion from guards. It was a small discovery, but it meant they could chip through walls 2 or 3 times faster without making unusual breathing noises. Their planning lasted 6 months. Morris made the blueprints. The Anglin brothers did the most physical labor because they were strong enough to carve concrete quietly and consistently every night. West worked behind the scenes to gather information, redirect conversations, and keep guards distracted. They also had help from unnamed inmates in the barber shop, the laundry area, and even the library, who passed items without asking questions. None of them needed to know the final plan. They just knew something was happening. And in a place like Alcatraz, shared silence was its own kind of currency. The dummy heads that fooled the night guards were not crude props. They were forensic-level replicas. The base was made from soap and toothpaste mixed with concrete dust to match skin tone under low light. The finishing touch came from real human hair swept off the floor of the prison barbershop. Each head looked convincing enough that guards doing quick flashlight sweeps would not notice a thing. And to keep the vents from rattling, the men replaced metal bolts with carved pieces of soap that were painted to look like real hardware. They could remove them every night and snap them back in place every morning, leaving no trace. But here is the part that still puzzles investigators. They knew exactly when they would have a 30-minute window to move through the tunnels, climb the pipes, cross the roof, and reach the shoreline without being spotted. How did they know that window existed when the guards themselves claimed the timing of patrols always varied? The tidal gambit. Why modern science rewrites history. The answer really does start with that strange bit of hydrodynamic modeling from Delft University, something the FBI simply did not have the tools to calculate back in 1962. Because on that cold June night, when 3 men dragged a homemade raft toward the edge of the island, they were stepping into one of the most dangerous pieces of water in the United States. What looks calm in old black and white footage hides a network of currents that twist around you like moving glass. Anyone who launches at the wrong time gets pulled toward the Pacific, and once you're drifting toward the open ocean at night, you are not coming back. That is what made the discovery from the Delft team in 2012 so surprising. When they ran their simulation, they did not start with drama or legend. They fed the bay's water speeds, wind direction, tidal pull, and historical weather into a model that recreated the exact conditions of June 11, 1962. And what they found was something the escape story had never included. At exactly 11:30 at night, the tides shifted into a brief zone of stillness that lasted about 30 minutes. Not calm water, but a moment where the outgoing pull weakened enough for a small craft to slip across the current instead of being shoved into the ocean. The shock came when they overlaid this model with the estimated escape timeline from surviving inmate accounts. Morris, the Anglin brothers, and West had been working for months on a clock, choosing every minute carefully. They chipped at vents when guard footsteps faded. They climbed the utility pipes during the shift change that created noise across the cell block. And when they finally reached the shoreline, the time they launched was not approximate. It was pinned to one single moment, 11:40 p.m. If they had launched before 11:30, Delft's simulation showed the escape would have turned into a slow slide toward the Golden Gate, then a hard pull directly into the Pacific. That route kills you within minutes. Because the water is so cold, it shuts down your limbs before you even realize what's happening. And if they had launched after midnight, the current would have pushed them straight back toward Alcatraz, turning the raft into a slow-moving circle until sunrise exposed everything. But their launch at 11:40 sat right inside that safe corridor. 10 minutes into the window, 20 minutes before it closed, almost like they were following a map that did not exist publicly at the time. That raises a question that still bothers researchers today. How did 3 prisoners with no access to tide charts, no weather tools, no approval to study bay data, and no official documents know something it took modern computers to calculate? Did someone help them? Did they piece together patterns from watching the shoreline during work assignments? Or did they gain access to restricted materials through the same quiet inmate network that moved tools across the island? The more the scientists ran simulations, the more the mystery deepened. They tested scenarios where the men paddled directly toward Angel Island, because that was the direction the FBI assumed they were heading. Every one of those attempts ended with the raft spinning off course or stalling in the wrong part of the water. But the moment they adjusted the paddling angle toward the Golden Gate bridge lights and treated the crossing like a diagonal ferry run, the results flipped. Suddenly, the escape succeeded in nearly every simulation. The model showed that by aiming at the bright line of the bridge and paddling parallel to the current instead of against it, the men had an almost certain chance of landing safely at Horseshoe Bay on the Marin side. This is where modern science challenged the official story. The FBI believed the prisoners washed up near Angel Island or drifted into the bay because a paddle was found floating between the 2 points. For decades, that piece of evidence was treated like a sign of failure. But when researchers plotted the exact location of the paddle on their modern map, it matched the path of a successful crossing toward Horseshoe Bay, not a failed attempt toward Angel Island. It was the kind of clue that hides in plain sight until you shift the destination. Even NOAA scientists, who normally approach these questions with a very conservative lens, said publicly that the men could have reached the shore safely with the raft design they built. Their materials were enough to stay afloat, and their timing, whether guessed or guided, was nearly perfect. When you combine that with the new shoreline data and the recovered physical evidence, the picture becomes harder to ignore. Science does not say maybe. It says they could have made it, and if they paddled the way the models suggest, they almost certainly did. But that leaves us with a bigger question. If the tidal science points toward survival, and if the modern simulations show a nearly perfect crossing, why did the FBI insist for decades that all 3 men drowned? The evidence that should not exist. The contradiction begins small, something the FBI never expected anyone to notice twice. After the escape, agents recovered a wallet on the shoreline with photographs inside. Official reports claimed the pictures belonged to one of the Anglins and were ruined by water. But the photos told a different story. They were almost untouched. Paper that drifts through cold San Francisco Bay usually curls, separates, or dissolves. These were intact, almost dry, raising a question the investigators never answered. How does a wallet that supposedly drifted through tidal currents look like it was carried on land? Then there was the raft. Pieces washed onto Angel Island were described as punched apart, as if torn by the ocean. Years later, a former corrections officer quietly admitted the fragments looked more like they had been dismantled on a shoreline. The edges were frayed straight, the kind of pattern you get when you rip something intentionally. If the raft had broken in the water, the damage would have been jagged and uneven. Instead, it looked like someone scattered the pieces to confuse the search. Even the footprints on Angel Island don't match a drowning scenario. If 3 men had fallen into the water and tried to swim, there would be no clean prints in the sand. But park logs from the morning after the escape describe a straight set of footprints leading from the shore toward the trees. No dragging marks, no stumbling, no traces of hypothermic crawling, just deliberate steps walking away from the water. The kind of steps you take when you are cold, tired, and trying not to be seen. The FBI quietly scaled down the search after just 10 days. Not because interest waned, but because they assumed the men had left the region. Decades later, released documents revealed agents had received tips from Brazil and South America within months of the escape. Strangers described the same scenario: two quiet American men working on farms, keeping to themselves, and speaking with a northern U.S. accent. The details, age, height, build, matched the Anglins, yet the FBI dismissed it. A photograph from the 1970s deepened the mystery. It showed two men beside a simple farm truck in rural Brazil. Their faces were older, sun-weathered, and worn by years outdoors. Decades later, forensic analysts ran facial comparison software measuring bone structure, ear position, jaw length, and brow shape. The match came back extremely likely. Not proof, but stronger than any argument for drowning. Then, in 2013, a letter arrived at a San Francisco police station, claiming to be from John Anglin. He wrote that he was alive, Clarence had died in 2008, and Frank Morris had died even earlier. The handwriting was shaky, the tone pleading. He asked for medical help and offered to turn himself in. The FBI tested the letter for weeks. Handwriting, fingerprints, DNA, but results were inconclusive. Neither a match nor a denial, just that maddening middle ground. The government treated the case seriously. They still do. There is nothing, no raft, no body, no scrap of clothing, that definitively proves the men drowned. The official story assumes a reckless escape swept away by violent waters. But every modern test and hidden clue suggests the opposite. The plan was calculated, the timing precise, the materials chosen with intelligence, and someone on the outside may have been ready to help. The narrative of Alcatraz as escape proof begins to unravel. The man left behind, Allen West's untold tragedy. They called him the forgotten conspirator, the quiet mind in the shadow of men who became legends. Allen West wasn't an extra in the Alcatraz escape story. He was one of the original architects, living 2 cells from Frank Morris and directly above the Anglin brothers. He drilled the holes, carved the vents, and scrubbed dust into his socks to hide every trace. On paper, he was supposed to disappear with them that night. There were 4 men, not 3. But the tragedy begins with something painfully ordinary. West had been patching the edges of his vent hole with a homemade paste to hide the widening gap. A mix of soap, dust, and stolen paint chips. Normally, it dried soft enough to remove, but the damp coastal air hardened it faster than usual. By the time West returned to clear the vent that night, the opening had shrunk, the grill jammed. The one thing he needed to move refused to budge. Imagine hearing everything happen on schedule, while trapped behind a square of stubborn concrete. He heard Morris slip through his vent, the Anglins crawling through theirs, footsteps echoing down the utility corridor, and the faint clatter of tools lifted from their hidden workshop. West shoved, scraped, and tried again. The clock didn't stop. By the time he broke through, the others were gone. Alone, he crawled through the utility shaft, climbed the pipes, and popped onto the roof, staring at an island answered only by the wind. The water below carried the sound of men he'd planned with, now pushing into the bay. The scene waiting for him was almost cruel. Unfinished gear lay neatly set aside. A partially inflated pontoon, a wooden paddle, 3 life preservers, and 1 extra raft meant for him. They hadn't abandoned him. They expected him. Yet the tide didn't wait. When the guards discovered the escape, West didn't fight or lie. He cooperated fully with the FBI, giving every detail, every conversation, and every tool used. And most people never talk about this. He wasn't charged, not even with a conspiracy. The man who helped plan one of the most embarrassing prison escapes in history walked away with nothing added to his sentence. The question lingers. Did he talk his way out, or had he already decided not to leave? He described the plan perfectly. Angel Island, rest, cross to Marin County, steal clothes, find a car, head to Mexico, but something feels off. Why didn't he follow them into the water? Why stop at the empty beach? Some say he froze. Others thought that he panicked. A darker possibility: West may have doubted the journey. The cold water, the tides, the pitch-black night. Or maybe Morris and the Anglins couldn't risk waiting for him. 3 men knew their one shot, and the weakest link was left behind. West wasn't just physically stuck that night, he was emotionally trapped for the rest of his life, watching 3 friends become legends while his story curled into a footnote. It wasn't 4 men breaking free together, it was 3 men leaving one behind. And the silence around that decision hints at something far darker than most realize. Because what happened to West isn't just a personal tragedy, it's a clue. And that abandonment connects to a larger institutional failure. But why would Alcatraz itself be responsible for the outcome of that night? The prison that closed itself. Why Alcatraz couldn't survive their success. They closed it fast, and they closed it quietly. And the reason reads like an admission no one wanted to make out loud. On June 23, 1962, exactly 11 days after those 3 men vanished into the dark, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy signed the order to close Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary. By March 21, 1963, the island would be shuttered for good. The press framed it as a practical move about future escape risks and taxpayer costs, but the truth beneath the lines is sharper and stranger. Alcatraz had been an experiment in containment, built where water and rock could do half the work. It held the nation's most dangerous inmates, and the federal government liked to sell the myth of an escape-proof fortress. In reality, the place was expensive and inefficient. At its peak, the prison could hold 336 men, and over 29 years it housed just 1,576 inmates in total. Running the island costs roughly $13 per inmate per day, while other federal prisons average about $5. That made Alcatraz roughly 2.5 times more expensive to operate than the rest of the system. Ask any modern manager, and they will tell you the math alone was a good reason to close it. But money only tells part of the story. The real sting came from reputation. For decades, Alcatraz's value was as a symbol, a living advertisement that the federal system could lock away the worst offenders and sleep easily. The island's publicity machine fed that idea so well that the public forgot the cracks. Then 3 men proved the symbol was fragile. When newsreel footage and inked headlines spread the story of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers, the notion of an impenetrable federal fortress started to unravel. If Alcatraz could be escaped from, what else could slip through the cracks of a system the public trusted? Decision-makers faced a simple choice: admit a systemic failure and spend millions fixing infrastructure and procedures across the prison network, or shut down the icon and move on. Robert Kennedy, who had bigger priorities on his desk, chose the latter. Closing Alcatraz stopped the immediate embarrassment. It costs less politically to dismantle the symbol than to admit the system that built that symbol was flawed. The closure read like a bandage applied to a wound the federal government did not want examined. The institutional crisis had deeper ripples. If a prison that advertised itself as escape-proof could be breached by a spoon, some careful timing, and a homemade raft, the assumptions underpinning maximum security design suddenly looked naive. The structural problems that allowed the escape were not just craftsmanship. They were budget choices, material shortcuts, and a faith that isolation equals invulnerability. The island's concrete was vulnerable to salt water. Maintenance was always strained by the cost of getting supplies to an island, and staffing had to balance security with cost constraints. Those are not quirky local failures. Those are design and policy failures that could exist in any prison system. This is why the closure matters beyond nostalgia. The government's choice to shutter Alcatraz rather than publicly overhaul federal penitentiary policy is a revealing act. It suggests a preference for removing an embarrassing monument rather than fixing the problem that the monument exposed. That decision shaped how America handled security and optics for decades. Rather than building a better, transparent model of maximum security incarceration, we let the story become mythology and moved the policy needle elsewhere. And there is an irony worth feeling. A place built to be impenetrable ended up being too costly to maintain its facade. Closing Alcatraz solved a PR problem. It did not solve the deeper questions the escape raised about oversight, engineering, and the assumptions authorities made about human ingenuity. The island closed its doors, but the doubts the escape exposed did not go with them. They festered in memos, in quiet budget debates, and in the choices made when other prisons were designed or renovated. So yes, the escape was 3 men on a raft, but the real consequence was bigger. It destabilized a national story about control and competence and forced officials to choose the easiest fix, not the most honest one. If 3 inmates could puncture the illusion of total security, what else about the federal system relied on myth instead of truth? But what was the single moment that proved they were right all along and forced the country to act? The proof nobody wanted: John Paul Scott's successful swim. 6 months after Morris and the Anglins disappeared, someone finally proved they were right. John Paul Scott, an inmate at Alcatraz, decided to test the waters, literally. In December 1962, Scott attempted something that had always been dismissed as impossible: swimming from the island to the San Francisco mainland. And unlike the stories of clever tools, homemade rafts, or whispered escape plans, Scott had nothing but his own body and a stubborn will to survive. The distance was brutal. About 2.7 nautical miles separated him from Fort Point, near the Golden Gate Bridge, through icy, choppy water and powerful tidal currents. Alcatraz wasn't just a prison on a rock. It was surrounded by a natural moat designed to make anyone think twice. He dove in, and against every prediction, he made it. He reached the mainland. Not partway, not close enough to wave and be rescued. He actually touched land. Of course, freedom wasn't in the cards. Scott was found shivering, exhausted, and hypothermic, lying on the shore, and was quickly captured by authorities. But the point wasn't whether he stayed free. The point was that it could be done. For decades, the federal government had built Alcatraz's myth around the idea that no one could ever cross the bay. Scott tore that narrative apart in one icy swim. He didn't just succeed. He handed proof to anyone willing to look that human endurance and planning could conquer the so-called escape-proof island. And the timing is key. Just 6 months after the Morris Anglin disappearance, Scott's swim was a living validation of their plan. If a single man, with nothing more than his own strength and determination, could survive that distance, imagine what 3 men could do with a raft: paddles, life jackets, and a careful understanding of tides. Suddenly, the impossible became entirely plausible. Scott didn't just swim to prove himself, he unwittingly confirmed what federal authorities had refused to admit. Alcatraz's reputation as escape-proof was a carefully maintained fiction. The impact on the institution was immediate, if quiet. Closure procedures accelerated. Officials had to face the fact that the public's trust in Alcatraz was based on myth, not reality. And so Scott's story was carefully buried because it contradicted everything the prison stood for. Absolute security, absolute containment. No headlines, no fanfare, just a quiet acknowledgement that the island had been exposed for what it was: a fortress vulnerable to determination and ingenuity. What Scott gave the world wasn't freedom, it was proof. Proof that the currents could be beaten, that human endurance mattered, and that 3 men with a raft, a clever pump, and a little planning could absolutely survive. He rewrote the rules in the cold waters of San Francisco Bay. And for anyone paying attention, he made one thing crystal clear: Alcatraz was never as untouchable as the government claimed. So, if one man could achieve this on his own, what does that mean for the escapes that came before, and for the system that decided to pretend nothing could ever get out? Which brings us to the final mystery: why America stopped looking. The evidence points to one inescapable conclusion. Tidal models show they could have survived. John Paul Scott proved the waters could be crossed. Letters and photos decades later suggest they did. Yet America's law enforcement didn't follow the trail. Why? Because admitting the truth meant admitting failure. Federal security had been outsmarted by 3 ordinary men, and Alcatraz's escape-proof myth was shattered. Footage from Alcatraz shows what nobody expected. Not the escape, but the institutional blindness. The real escape wasn't from Alcatraz, it was from accountability. That prison, it's still standing. What do you think happened to Morris and the Anglins? Drop your theory in the comments.